There are an immense number of gacha games out there, and I've covered Blue Archive, Genshin Impact, and Arknights. I've also briefly touched on Counterside and Art of Year Fusion. Now, my previous videos regarding certain games communities have been vaguely negative, with me discussing primarily just how a bad community experience can impact a game's success, impact the external point of view people have of it, and their continued experience and playing of that game. I asked you guys in the community tab and in the comments beneath my community video regarding Arknights, Blue Archive, and Genshin Impact, how your experiences were, what your worst experiences with certain communities were, and what your best ones were as well. If you'd like to give a much more in-depth one, please consider joining the Discord server, as I will be asking the people in that server to give their thoughts, their experiences, and tell me their expectations regarding a new community, or perhaps the communities that they don't want to interact with. The link will be down below in the description as well. With that being said, I do believe everybody here can agree that a negative reaction or a negative community that has either soured your point of view or your experience of the game in some way, shape, or form, or in some other way criticizes and makes other games look bad. With that being said, I'm not talking about one game being so good it makes others look worse by comparison. I'm more or less discussing a community negatively reacting to something that's happening in their game and thereby passing on a lot of that anger and negative emotions to another game. An example could be the Genshin Impact first anniversary, when they would repeatedly, after not getting a response or a good enough response from Hoyoverse themselves, went over and downvoted and 1-star rated and reviewed other games. In regards to the opinions that people mentioned, one of the top voted ones was regarding Genshin Impact, and it's primarily not necessarily because the game itself is bad. It's because, in my opinion, and a lot of opinions of other individuals, the community chooses to oftentimes weaponize themselves or in some way rally against either one content creator, one company, whether that be Hoyoverse or another game, or oftentimes do their best to sour the experience of new players, even if it is accidental. Genshin Impact, by all standards, is not a PvP game, but the community treats it like it is, in that a new character will be either rated good or bad depending on how well they defy or beat the current meta. You also have the fact where you have, even right now with Sumer releasing, the vast fan base, not the entirety of it, but a good chunk of it, clamoring around the concept of there not being enough representation in this gacha game. And in many others, that's not necessarily an issue. You don't hear people arguing about that, or at least I haven't, in the Blue Archive, Arknights, Art of Year, Counterside communities. And sure, this could be due to the nature of the games themselves, but Genshin Impact has arguably one of the most aggressive fan bases. And also one of the loudest, especially because of how large they are. So when you're discussing negative communities and negative experiences, a vast majority of people are going to say Genshin was a negative or is the worst objectively because of how large it is. You're much more inclined to have a negative experience with the Genshin community than you are with something like the Arknights community. I'm not saying that none of the communities are absolutely perfect, but what I am saying is that Genshin has the biggest chance of being the most imperfect. Once you add the inclusion of the chat system via friends, via co-op, you have a much worse experience. An example is many individuals know that people who play Hu Tao prefer to be on lower HP. So if you play a healer such as Kokomi, you're inclined to annoy them, and they're very much inclined to express that. Even earlier on with systems such as co-op and with things like artifacts, when artifacts used to drop on the ground, a thing that I know a lot of individuals will remember who have played the game since later on, artifacts used to drop on ground at the end of the domain, and Venties, or individuals with animal characters who at the time was a Sucrose, a Jean, a Venti, or the Traveler, could utilize their elemental burst to drop and essentially pull the artifacts away from players to the extent to where they wouldn't be able to get them, which is why it's no longer a thing in the current state of the game. But let's ignore that. Let's move away from Genshin Impact. What about Arknights? It's a much older game by a couple years, and arguably the community is much more well established. Arknights has a weird reputation. For me, I had never played it before hearing about it from Tactone, and he had a negative experience, so I was prepared to have a much worse experience than I did with Genshin Impact and the Arknights community. From my own personal experience, I've had a great time with that community. The guides are really helpful, the people in that community are very helpful, and the characters are nice. The gacha, in my opinion, is one of the worst, but hey. Given all of that, I think that even though the Arknights community may not be the best, and I understand individuals may have had a terrible experience with that community, I do believe that if you're comparing it to the competition, it's much more welcoming. But I also understand that a lot of individuals may have a much more negative sentiment regarding it. However, with that same thing being said, there is the concept that Arknights does have a much more forgiving system of clear, so you have lower rarity units that can clear content pretty effectively. Not saying Genshin can't, but I am saying it's a bit more difficult depending on the circumstance, and there isn't much difficult content in Genshin to begin with. However, Arknights does also have the problem of, considering that the game itself requires a bit more strategy, there is almost a pedigree or prestige to playing Arknights. This is not a guarantee, this is something that happens every now and again, but individuals who do play Arknights sometimes do feel a bit more or act as though they are more superior than other gacha players simply because of how much strategy or thinking that Arknights does require. To that same extent, it does mean that from an outside perspective, if you're just getting into the game and people aren't either helpful or you see that the community is really very proud about how difficult their game can be sometimes, then it does sour your experience. It's the equivalent to something like Dark Souls, in that the player base of Dark Souls does take pride in their game being difficult, but sometimes that pride also overtakes a welcoming newcomer experience, meaning that for newer players, in the event that you yourself are just getting into the Souls series, whether that be with Bloodborne, Elden Ring, the Dark Souls series itself, Demon Souls, it doesn't matter. Asking for help can sometimes be met with just get good, just play the game, and just learn yourself, as opposed to the community attempting to help you understand the mechanics or understand how certain systems work, which can work to that community's disadvantage. It's why certain games are known to have very impenetrable fan bases, where it's very difficult to get into the game if you can't naturally do it yourself. And I do think that Arknights has the potential to become like that, a game in which the difficulty in later on content and in strategy does in some way put off newer players, and if the community itself can't compensate for that by welcoming them, then it does lead them to just drop the game altogether. At the end of the day, no community is perfect, but there are certain subsets of the community that are bad. A lot of individuals say just Genshin Twitter is bad, and I believe Genshin Twitter is awful. Never go there. It's the absolute worst of the worst. However, Genshin Twitter is not the only bad place. The entirety of Genshin has, like, I'd say a 20 to maybe 40%, which is just awful to interact with. The other 60 or 80% can be really good. However, the thing is, the people who are really good and really nice to interact with don't get nearly as much spotlight as the bad side. Nor is it the case in which they're very vocal about it, because they don't need to be. They just play the game and enjoy their time. The same thing applies to Arknights, the same thing applies to Blue Archive, Shanghai Impact, Counterside, Artery Gear. There are so many different gacha games that it's impossible to cover each and every one of them. And with so many different subsets of communities, for instance, if you go to a Reddit, a subreddit, or a Discord server like my own, or even if you attempt to go to the Twitter section of that game or the Twitter side and interact with those individuals, you can have an entirely different experience going from one platform to another. The Twitch experience for Genshin could be much more nice and much more welcoming than the Twitter experience with Genshin. And so as a direct result, interacting with the game entirely depends, and your experience entirely depends on where you go for that. I would never recommend going to Twitter for that, but I'd also say it's very difficult sometimes to find a good fan base. Reddit is oftentimes a great place to interact because there are a lot of newer players who gravitate towards that because it's easier to find the subreddit than it is to find the Discord. But you also have the instances in which the subreddit and Discord is an awful place. Once again, circling right back to Genshin Impact, the subreddit is essentially manually reviewed for certain content at times, especially regarding negative things, and the Discord is awful occasionally. There have been numerous bad experiences in which people get banned for mentioning certain things, or for discussing leaks accidentally, or even official characters that the mods just don't know about. Even have content creators like MTash who have negative and horrible experiences with the Discord server. Just in summary, TLDR, don't play Genshin Impact and go to any of the public communities. Just play it casually yourself, or build your own community like I have. Most individuals who play a gacha game know the game's reputation. I know that Blue Archive has arguably an awful reputation because of the age or the setting of the game itself. So when you discuss Blue Archive, a lot of people attach a negative connotation to the game and to the art of the characters. Whereas if you play Genshin Impact, I think a lot of individuals do know, even I myself have experienced this, wherein once I mention the game, you have individuals who will immediately go to topics like Klee or Diona or Kusanali and sort of seem to have that perspective in view of the game, in that it's marketed and geared towards individuals who prefer those characters, when really that's the minority of characters in the game. So no gacha is perfect. Every gacha game has its own bad community, its bad side, its bad viewpoints and opinions, and even the times in which it's trending for doing something stupid or idiotic. But I don't think any gacha is purely awful. I don't think any community is purely awful. I just think a lot of individuals, myself included, have bad experiences that heavily impact your desire to interact with that community. I, for instance, never want to interact with Genshin Twitter or a lot of the Genshin community just because of how toxic that fan base is. But I also understand that you can also find some really great players. If you're a Genshin player and you love the game, hey, join my Discord server. You're pretty cool. At the end of the day, we can moderate that experience a lot better. So tell me your thoughts down below. What's your worst gacha experience, and what game have you just quit because of the community? My name's been Shikai. Subscribe if you've enjoyed, and I hope to see you next time.